Support for the Choral Commons comes from the University of San Diego, the Karen and Tom Mulvaney Center for Community, Awareness and Social Action, and the College of Arts and Sciences Arts Engagement Initiative.
USD's Arts Engagement Initiative supports artistic action embedded in and responsive to ever-changing social, cultural, and political circumstances, deep and meaningful engagement with community, and increased access to the arts on the USD campus and beyond.
The Choral Commons is a community where choral music practitioners and organizations can gather in order to envision equity-centered choral futures. With our community and creative partners, we hope to empower choral practitioners with additional strategies for innovation grounded in culturally responsive, critical, and equity-centered values.
My name is Emily Amrine.
And I am Andre de Quadros.
And this is the Choral Commons podcast.
Frankly, I used to say we need to be using as much of our energy and intention to learn the music of other cultures as we do with classical music. And actually, I don't believe that anymore. Now I believe we need to be taking more energy and more of our attention. We need to be studying this music over long periods of time. I think when we try to strive for authenticity, it means engaging in a lifelong relationship with that tradition's music. It's not a one-off. And no, you can't ever achieve authenticity. It doesn't mean anything. That would be like, I will become this culture. You can't Rachel Dolezal yourself into another culture's music. I will never be a master teacher or a culture bearer of South African music. But I'm going to try over time to know exactly which choices I'm making when I choose to perform a song in a certain way. Which choices am I making, and can I own those choices with a good conscience? And in the end, also recognizing that it's not about my intention, it's only about my impact.
Since late last century, choral musicians and music educators have been deeply invested in multiculturalism as a pedagogical tool for bridging cultural divides and building empathy. Multiculturalism's great potential has been accompanied by a host of related problems, from cultural sensitivity and questions of authenticity to the ethical transmission of cultural practice. More recently, the discourse has centered around cultural appropriation, coloniality, and fairness. In the center of this tangled and slippery conversation, choral musicians are struggling to find an equity-centered way of global and non-Eurocentric music making. Patty Cuyler is a workshop leader and choral director known for her expertise in teaching Corsican, Georgian, and South African music. Since 1995, she has been co-director of Village Harmony, a Vermont-based community music organization with educational and travel programs centered around communal song traditions from around the world. Mollie Stone serves as choral director and lecturer at the University of Chicago, director of world music and conductor at Chicago Children's Choir, co-director of Chicago World Music Chorus, and a teacher for Village Harmony. She lectures and gives workshops on Black South African choral music across the country, working to promote the work of Black South African composers, conductors, and choirs. I'm wondering, Patty, if you can just give us a sense of, for our listeners who may be less familiar with your work, about Village Harmony and kind of the ideas that it sort of initially inspired you to start this.
Well, Village Harmony was begun 40 years ago by Larry Gordon, who is pretty much a self-taught choir conductor from Vermont. He grew up singing in high school and then became interested in touring groups through working with Bread and Puppet Theater and then interested in shape note music and started touring with a small high school group and ended up founding Village Harmony, which began as a teenage high school music performing summer camp. And right away started inviting foreign teachers who were in the United States to come and teach, Bulgarian, Bosnian, other genres. I started in a few years after he began the organization and was really interested in the people that we were meeting on tours, which expanded our teaching repertoire tremendously. performing at Festival 500 in Newfoundland, for example. We met Martha Kalabopape, a South African choir conductor who brought her 40-person strong ensemble to perform that was in 1999. And starting the following year, she began teaching for Village Harmony. So we had a real South African as opposed to third-hand songs that we'd been doing before. We were working with Tatiana Sarbinska in the mid-90s and learning Bulgarian songs, whereas previously Larry had been learning from American groups who had, picked up a few songs. So this, in the late 90s, we started working with Georgian singers. And as we toured in those countries, in Georgia and Bulgaria and South Africa, we started meeting other choir conductors who were willing to teach foreigners. And that became the switching from being a world music chorus that we would learn songs second or third hand to going after the source and learning both from conductors who came to the United States to teach our groups and then arranging for 3-week study performance tours in those countries, in Bulgaria, Georgia, South Africa, Bosnia, Macedonia, Ghana even. We realized how important that, not just learning music was, but learning it authentically and learning it in situ. So going to the countries and getting the whole ambiance. And since that time, since the early 2000s, we've really been trying to expand the countries and genres that we travel to and the directors that we work with, but also getting quality materials and arranging for other people to have workshops with these singers when they came to the United States.
So we'll talk a little bit in a few minutes about those two things you said, authentically and quality materials. So we'll come back to that because I think that these are nice big signposts for us to hang our discussion on, because this is the kind of conversation that people are interested in. But perhaps we could ask Mollie how you came to this. I mean, you have a name that's synonymous with South African music. Your work on the Vela project and other work that you've done positions you in the forefront of this kind of work, and your work is distinct. So can you give the listener kind of a frame of reference for your work?
Yeah, I mean, what's fascinating is that I came into the realm of my work in terms of trying to find more authentic ways of learning and teaching Black South African choral music, sort of by chance, in that when I was a teenager and I got to travel to South Africa right after the first democratic elections, I was so incredibly blown away by the power of how Black South Africans not only had used their choral music in the struggle against apartheid, but also how they were adapting the music to use in the creation of a new identity, this new rainbow nation, and in how ubiquitous the choral music was, and in how different it was from anything I'd heard anywhere else. I mean, people would spontaneously burst into 4-part harmony with complex dance movements. The music was rhythmic, it was off the beat, everything was syncopated, and it was nothing like what I had been taught growing up. And that confusion, I mean, it made me question everything. It was like, why did I grow up in this country where we had access to the most resources in the world and I couldn't learn how this music really sounded? And what did it make me feel when I first heard it versus when I heard it in South Africa?
I heard your presentation at ACDA, gosh, like it must have been 15 years ago at this point, and you were presenting on Black South African choral music, and I had this similar experience of being moved by your description of it and your teaching of it, and when I encountered the Vela Vela project and how you were able to transmit these songs using DVDs at that time, rather than Western European notation. And so to me, it was like that was the first introduction I had to your work. Was it was about the transmission of songs and using technology as a way to kind of resist kind of the colonialism of Western European notation. But what I think this points to, and how this connects to the conversation now more generally, is that you really are at the forefront of the conversation about encountering music through culture bearers, right? And so I'm wondering if you have some thoughts just about that paradigm. And to me, I really learned this language kind of through colleagues working in ethnic studies here in California, and certainly not in the choral world at all. And so I'm wondering if you have like what your experience with that language of culture bearing is, what you understand it to be, and how it relates to your work.
Well, part of working with a culture bearer is, in fact, trusting that they know better than foreigners the best and most authentic and most meaningful way to learn their music. And it's the one thing that the West has resisted, is that we believe that in order to learn another culture's music, we have to somehow translate it into our own learning system. And I strongly disagree with that, because I had grown up learning South African songs that had been transcribed into Western notation. And of course, I was raised to believe that West was best, and paper trained meant that you were, somehow higher, more elevated in terms of your everything, intellectualism, whatever. But in fact, I came to realize when I heard South African music
just
on the ground,
brown people were also educated into believing that white people were better too. You know what I mean?
Of course.
That's how I grew up.
Well, what was so amazing was, of course, realizing, I had maybe 5 minutes where I sat down and thought, maybe I'll try to notate all of this, and realized that Western notation is in fact too simple. It's not complex enough to handle all of the complexities and intricacies that are involved in Black South African choral music. And I suddenly realized that that was probably true for most music around the world that is not notated. And suddenly I realized, wait, maybe instead of insisting upon learning it in my own system, I should be trusting culture bearers to teach me how to learn their music. And sure enough, that was when I started to realize that, of course, Black South Africans transmit this music in the oral tradition, and so should we. And even though I can study it as much as I want and try to transmit it, if I could instead provide an opportunity for culture bearers to transmit the music more directly themselves and on their own terms, even if that means, unfortunately, having to use technology rather than being in person, that was still ideal over trying to force a music that is not meant to be notated into a system of notation that's not meant for it. So, and again, I realized very early on that notation is not just about accuracy, it's about so much more. When I learned South African music that had been transcribed, it had been inevitably simplified and dumbed down in order to fit into Western notation. And what that meant was that I was led to believe that this music was in fact more simple and more primitive than it actually was, because of course I couldn't help but buy into the ideas of white supremacy and racism that had been entrenched in my everyday life from the time I was born, no matter how woke I thought I was from a small age. But in fact, learning these simplified westernized versions only led me to confirm these sort of racist beliefs about another culture. And it wasn't until I was willing to let a culture bearer decide how I should best learn their music that I was able to understand just how rich and complex and beautiful and powerful the music actually was.
Well, and one of the other things that like the notation process does is it is an externalization from the body, right? And so it disembodies the music. And this is the other thing that I noticed, immediately in your session at ECDA 15 years ago, right? That this was an embodied practice. Patty, I wanted to invite you to kind of reflect on how this is connected to the traditions that you referenced earlier in the conversation.
I agree with Mollie about that aha moment when you realize that all of the paper is a hindrance rather than a help in really learning the music. And it's not just learning from the teacher, but being alongside other singers from a tradition that has been the most important, the most profound experiences we have working abroad is not working with a single musician, but working with an ensemble, where we're sitting with them and we can feel how they breathe, that we can sense how tense their body is from listening to the tuning of the other singers, what the body stance is. There's so much more than just the notes and the absence of notation that one gets from working with tradition bearers around the world.
I mean, I'm going to come with a funny story. And I was at a conference, and somebody came to me and asked me. He said, "I want to have an Indian song for my class." And I said, "Why would you want that?" And this teacher said to me, a choral music person, I think, said, "Well, I have Indian kids in my class." And I said, "Yes, but so which part of India is that family from?" And she said, "Well, I don't really know." And I said, "Well, where do they what language do they speak at home?" And she said, I don't really know." And we went on with a few more questions, and I said, I really can't give you a song. I mean, I am a culture bearer, if you like. And this is the problem with culture bearers, that we have described culture bearing within the frame of the nation state. And so when I said to her, "Well, I am a culture bearer of the culture in which I locate myself, but the culture in which I'm located is probably not going to be the culture in which you're from where the family of your child comes from." And so I think this is an important issue. And having worked in Indonesia and the Arab world and in Sri Lanka and so many different parts of the world, I have to say that I'm not so certain that the person we are talking to is really a culture bearer. So when we went to Indonesia, for example, it was kind of I did this project, as an intercultural project between one of the choirs I was working with from northern Sulawesi and Balinese musicians. Well, you know what? They had less in common with each other than the North Sulawesi choir had with the Western notated tradition, because Christianity had placed a heavy footprint on the North Sulawesi people to the extent that they really couldn't understand the music of Bali. So for somebody to have gone to these North Sulawesi Indonesians and say, "You're from Indonesia, and give me something about Indonesian music that may have come from Bali," would have been a simplistic view and way of seeing this notion of culture bearer. I'm simply saying this because culture bearer is far too simplistic.
You know, one of our favorite aspects of the camp programs that we lead is actually involving different culture bearers from very different parts of the place that we're going to. So when we do South Africa camps, we have two people who are as different as night and day serving as our culture bearers. And so we have someone from all the way from the south in Cape Town, from the townships, who is a native born Xhosa speaker. And then we have a northern Sotho speaker from as far north as possible, who comes from a very different upbringing. One is a woman, one is a man. I mean, they have very different, let's just say they represent two very different realms of the South African experience. And one of the most delightful aspects of having them teach together, they don't teach the same songs together, they teach their own repertoire, but watching the two of them learn to work with each other and negotiate the teaching of things that are very different but from the same nation, and negotiating the fact that they don't always believe the same things as each other, that they disagree oftentimes on certain elements of how the song is taught, because in fact things are done slightly differently in their two regions or by their, the singers in their choirs. And it's a great exercise for our participants, because of course then they get to see that there's no one way to be a South African and no one way to sing South African music. And we do this in every place that we go. Not only do we have oftentimes two very different people acting as master teachers or culture bearers, but we also involve the singers from their choirs who have very different experiences. And then once we're on the touring part of the trips, we we meet up with local ensembles in each of the places that we travel to, and each of those places is very different, and each of those ensembles is also has a very different approach to how they perform the local music in their own realm, as well as the more sort of national music. So we also prize this idea of making sure people understand that there is no single culture bearer who represents a genre. Just like you couldn't find one person to teach, quote, American music, right? That doesn't mean anything. And what you said is exactly right, that there is no such thing as a single culture bearer. And frankly, the more different the culture bearers are from each other, I think sometimes the more fun we have with our camp programs, because,
right.
Yeah.
And you've like identified like maybe the primary critique of multiculturalism, right? That multiculturalism is essentializing, and it positions a single voice as representing like a plurality of voices.
The idea of song collecting is foreign, absolutely foreign to our model. Our model is bringing people together and spending time together and learning from different subgenres. And that goes for every country that we take people to. Lithuania, the whole idea is bringing different teachers in for a residential week to learn a basic repertoire to perform with and for other people while on a tour, and then visiting very different musical ensembles. It's really different from saying I want an Indian song, and then that's going to represent India. But we'll go to Georgia and learn 15 songs, and they'll each be a different, deliberately a different region, a different dialect, different story, a different raison d'etre in society. You know, most of the folk musics that we try to learn have a purpose in society. It's not just there's a song that somebody composed, but there'll be a song for a funeral. In our summer program, our virtual programs, the first song that we learned from our South African teacher was a song about being lonely because of COVID.
Song is not song as object, but song in context.
Exactly.
And with like, Indian rags, rag for a full moon is not a rag that you perform in the afternoon ever. But things change so dramatically with globalization and westernization. Let's come back to these kind of big signposts that were referred to by both of you in different ways. This idea of authenticity, and let's have a quick kind of definition from each of you about authenticity. Maybe not a definition, but I mean, think about us. Think about me as a choral conductor who wants to know, what does Mollie Stone mean by authenticity? What does Patty Cuyler mean when she talks about authenticity? Why don't you go first, Mollie?
So I think there's two concepts that are important. One is recognizing the tendency to center Western comfort in learning other cultures, that is something we do, and that we often compromise the authenticity of other cultures' music in order to make our learning process more comfortable. And that can be anything from stripping our knowledge of the meaning of the text to not learning all the lyrics and not bothering to try to pronounce the language that it's in correctly, to forgiving ourselves for not trying to learn the dance movements or notating it or simplifying it or whatever else we might do, or maybe compromising the music so we sing it like it's written for the piano, for our intonation system, rather than learning all of these things as accurately as possible. So I would say that the first thing in striving for authenticity is to not center our comfort, but rather center the comfort of those who make the music, and say, we're going to try to learn this in the same ways, in prioritizing the same musical elements and perhaps cultural elements like context that our culture bearers use when learning it. So if they prioritize learning to sing the notes with the dance movement, that's what we're going to do too. If they prioritize only singing it at a certain time of day, we're going to do that too. We're going to try to adapt our learning process to match the culture bearers rather than our own, especially not prioritizing our comfort. And then the second element is applying the same amount of attention and energy to learning other cultures' music as we are used to using when we try to learn our own traditions, especially the classical realm. And that is something I think other people really don't think about, but that we should, I mean, frankly, I used to say we need to be using as much of our energy and intention to learn the music of other cultures as we do with classical music. And actually, I don't believe that anymore. Now I believe we need to be taking more energy and more of our attention. We need to be studying this music over long periods of time. I think when we try to strive for authenticity, it means engaging in a lifelong relationship with that tradition's music. It's not a one-off. It's not a, I want diversity and multicultural, I want to be able to check that box for my concert program, so I'm going to do one song from every country in the world and just like do a simplified version. No, it's that you need to be starting a relationship that lasts your entire life. And every time you come back to that tradition, you should be asking yourself, what elements of the performance tradition am I not doing authentically? What are the things I can't do authentically yet? And why? Why can't I do them authentically? Right. And what are the things I'm going to strive for in the future? And what do I need in order to do that effectively? And that every time you come back to the tradition, you are working consciously to make those decisions, to owning those decisions, and to being able to make more and more choices to perform the music as close to the original as possible. And no, you can't ever achieve authenticity. It doesn't mean anything. That would be like, I will become this culture. You can't Rachel Dolezal yourself into another culture's music. I will never be a master teacher or a culture bearer of South African music, but I'm going to try over time to know exactly which choices I'm making when I choose to perform a song in a certain way. Which choices am I making, and can I own those choices with a good conscience? And in the end, also recognizing that it's not about my intention. It's only about my impact. That is all that matters. If you're going to have, in order to have a good impact, you pretty much have to have good intention. So that's not even the question.
Let's turn over to you, Patty. Same question.
Well, I don't disagree with anything that Mollie said. I agree wholeheartedly, but I think that there's a bigger picture than that. I feel like there's a channeling that needs to happen of trying to knowing the stories. I think I am such a believer in stories and the history of the not just the songs, but to feel the culture. Eating the food, for goodness sake, that's why being in a country is so amazing, because you can be in there and be feeling more the songs coming through you. And there's so many of the tradition bearers that have taught with us over the years that use the same analogy, that the song is coming from behind them, through them, and from the past through the singer and into the future. And when a director, a teacher can imbue the singers with enough background knowledge, with a feeling for the language, for the musicality of the phrasing, beyond the notes, and get them into a place where they can also feel the song coming through them, and they're a vehicle for that song rather than they're performing the song, that it goes through them and on into the future. All of our really good teachers as well will say, everyone sings the way they sing. That doesn't mean that you can't use a South African vocal tone and use vibrato or a straight tone when it's either is appropriate. But you don't imitate, caricature a culture's sound. You need to find it within your own sound and have those little tools, the golden keys, about vocal placement, vocal tone, again, the use of sustain and vibrato or the lack thereof. Recognize those in the piece and then become that vehicle for the sound. And then that's really respecting and being authentic. But it's not it's not a caricature. It needs to become real with all of these other points.
You know, Patty, you said something very important. You talked about quality materials. I'm not going to ask you what you mean by quality materials. I'm going to ask you what you mean. What would you give me an example of bad quality materials that are currently being consumed and absorbed and popular and so on. That's, I mean, it's the reason I'm saying that is because we could talk about quality materials, and I think you've already in a sense referenced it in the conversation. But either you, Patty, or Mollie, give us an example of something out there that's happening that's bad quality.
Okay, so how about going to an ACDA convention and browsing through the new publications of South African music and finding piano accompaniment, finding a straightening rather of syncopated, a lot of South African music has an anticipation. So you would think that there would be lots of stuff, notes going ahead of the bar and the absence thereof. How about a lack of even a translation or made up words? This happens today. It's happened before. It's continuing. You find you find a song coming out, a South African song coming out that is something popular. We know it's popular in South Africa because we've been taught it in South Africa. And suddenly somebody who confesses that they just went to South Africa for a 2-week trip recorded the song in a church somewhere and published it with a drum or with a aforesaid accompaniment and no translation. That's bad, and we can see that every day if you walk into a collection of vocal music.
Yeah, not to mention how often we see, I have had to confront people who have published transcriptions of South African songs that they merely heard on YouTube. And they pretend that it's just a traditional thing, whereas we know exactly which video it was because there's a marker. There's a thing that the choir is singing that says the name of their choir in the thing, but the person never bothered to even figure out what the words meant and made up a translation. I mean, it's so bad. People really think they can get away with anything. And and not crediting the source, not giving any attribution to where they got it from, adding, West African or even worse, like instruments that just have nothing to do with South African culture, adding conga drums, and I mean, God only knows what. But also, again, it's that obliteration of the complexity in those transcriptions. One of the things that South African music is notorious for is having the dance movement be in 2 while the sung music is in 3. And having that 2 against 3 is really vital. And if you eliminate the dance movements, then it just becomes, it looks very simplistic, and it's not, in fact.
I mean, I think that we've talked now about like an ethic of approaching music making outside the kind of prevailing practice of Western European choral music. And I feel like there's so much more to talk about here. From, for example, the idea of kind of vocal caricature in sound production, and how, a lot of my white students, for example, have reservations about trying to not caricature. I mean, they're not, they understand that is not what they want to do. But they don't really understand how to make the sound sound like Black South African choral music, for example, without it being by its very nature a caricature. And I think of, again, the idea of sound production as it relates to language, because of course my students wouldn't have any issue with striving for accuracy in terms of pronunciation if language was what they were talking about. But somehow when it becomes sung language, it becomes almost more racialized, and they feel very anxious about that. But I know we don't have that much time left. So I want to make sure that we talk about 2 things. Number one, and I'll start with number one. how does this have to do with justice? And maybe Mollie, let's start with you. Because I think that we could really locate this conversation in terms of performance practice and kind of the ethics and problematizing multiculturalism as an educational framework. But, here in the Choral Commons, we're thinking about this as it relates to systemic inequities, injustices, and ideologies. And so I'm wondering if you can kind of bridge the conversation that we've had thus far with some of this.
Well, I think, obviously, showing people from another tradition that you are willing to take the same care and effort to learning how to perform their music well and learning about the music. Where is it performed? What does it mean to the people who create it? And trying to do it with them in any way that you can. That in terms of justice, you're showing people that you value them. And I feel like in our culture, there definitely is this sense of one of the ways in which white supremacy functions is that, we treat classical music differently than we teach, quote, world music in the choral realm. And once we start acknowledging that other traditions are just as complex and beautiful and deserving of our entire heart, mind, soul, and body, then we can show people that we in fact value those cultures just as much. And even if that's from within our own country, if we're talking about the music of Black spirituals, that we should be spending just as much time learning the history and the meaning and what the text is about and how those songs were adapted over time as we do for white music. And so I think, right there, then and there, that is a way in which we promote justice in terms of equity.
But the globalized colonial frame is actually I don't want to say necessarily dumbing down, but the simplifying and approach to it has happened all over. For example, if you look at the African American spiritual performed in Indonesia, and if you look at the African American spiritual performed in India, for example, it's exactly the same racialized way of decontextualizing the African American spiritual. So it's not just the white people are simplifying an approach to the African American spiritual, but that import of a colonial frame of positioning music and stripping it out of context and actually making the repertoire as sound objects internationally available is in fact widespread all over the world.
This is why we don't believe in just learning something from a piece you buy off J.W. Pepper. We believe in collaborating and working with culture bearers, teaching artists from those traditions, collaborating with those ensembles. And, it's all about making the connecting the music to the people.
Shutting down all of our in-person programs and having to go virtual is that it's so easy to be in touch with people now. To be able to learn a song from a tradition bearer halfway around the world instead of learning it from your white choral conductor. And that's the direction that we went all summer. It's been an amazing success, and it's really gotten Mollie and me thinking about our own personal future, because we've been the secondhand teachers of a lot of this music when we haven't been taking people to the other countries to study or having, the culture bearers come for a few weeks at a time. And in fact, what we want to go forward with all of our choirs this coming year, as they're virtual, is to have all of our non-American songs be introduced with a live Zoom session with the culture bearer, and have pre-recorded practice tracks and such, so that even if we end up leading the rehearsals, which we will after that introduction, all of the practice recordings that the singers will go back to will be first-person, first-hand tradition bearers singing the music. So there will be no question about the vocal quality that they will be striving for. We'll have virtual choir, practice tracks that people record, and they can compare. Do I sound like that? And one of the things that we have picked up from all of this work are knowing we're translators. We can say, well, this is how you can attain that vocal quality. And then we can judge, well, that does sound good, or you have to tweak it this way. But the whole advent of teaching using Zoom or another virtual platform is an amazing way of bridging the gap. And there's no excuse. Not only that, is a lot of white communities have a few miles away a great gospel singer leading a gospel choir in a Black church. That's who should be introducing your Black gospel piece.
Well, and the other thing is, now that we have Zoom, there is literally just no excuse anymore. You know, I mean, right. we this past week had, South Africans, Iranians, who frankly aren't supposed to be able to use Zoom, Georgians, Corsicans, everybody, New Zealanders, they're all on this Zoom call together learning music from each other and collaborating with each other. And It was like a dream come true. It was an absolute dream come true.
That's so amazing, right? Because I think so many of us are like lamenting the fact that we're going to be using this platform when in fact it's an opportunity.
Yeah, it's the best. It really is.
Andre and I spoke with Patty Cuyler and Mollie Stone in mid-July. You can learn more about their work with Village Harmony at www.villageharmony.org and the Chicago World Music Chorus at www.chicagoworldmusic.org. The Choral Commons podcast is hosted by Emily Amrine and Andre de Quadros, produced by Emily Amrine in partnership with Chorus America and the Eric Erickson International Choral Center, and supported by listeners like you.
Additional institutional and creative partners include the Harvard Choral Program, St. Olaf College, University of Hawaii Choirs, University of San Diego, Manado State University Choir, Navai Chamber Choir, and Voices 21C.
If your organization would like to join our list of sponsors, please reach out to us at thechoralcommons@gmail.com or consider joining our community of supporters on our website, where you can schedule regular donations of $5 or $10 a month to help us offset the costs of producing these programs.
The Choral Commons aims to provide a space for choirs and conductors to envision innovative and equity-centered practice. We produce podcasts and interactive webinars and offer curated resources on diversity, equity, and inclusion.
We connect and engage community in meaningful dialogue on pedagogy and practice, and incubate creative, artistic, and compassionate choral projects that empower choral music organizations to work for a just and peaceful world. The songs you heard throughout this episode featured the artistry of culture bearers who regularly collaborate with Village Harmony. We are particularly grateful for recordings from the Zedashe Ensemble, Bongani Magatiana and the Bongweni Old Apostolic Church Choirs, the University of Cape Town Choir for Africa, Marie-Ange Geronimi, Jean-Etienne Langiani, and the late Jacques Michaeli. You can learn more about these songs and artists on our website, www.thechoralcommons.com.